Okay, so we're going to switch gears now entirely. We sort of delved a little into the cultural, the historical context, and now I want to move to a different subject, and that is, I want to look at the processes that were set in motion by the tablets of the divine plan. And the tablets, as I mentioned, they captured the mood of the day. When they were written in 1916-17, they captured the mood. In other words, they sort of read the social reality. And they set out the actions that were needed to be taken at that time to respond to the conditions of the world. In this regard, let me just read a passage from the tablets of the divine plan that kind of illustrate this point. Abdu'l-Bahá says this: this world-consuming war has set such a conflagration in the hearts that no word can describe it. In all the countries of the world, the longing for universal peace is taking possession of men. There's not a soul who does not yearn for concord and peace. A most wonderful state of receptivity is being realized. This is through the consummate wisdom of God, so that capacity may be created, the standard of the oneness of world and humanity be upraised, and the fundamental of universal peace and the divine principles be promoted in the East and the West. Now, the Master, it seemed to me, is describing processes, things that are happening, the impact of world events on the mentality and the thinking of people, and the opportunities that this creates for the activity of the faith, the receptivity that emerges as a result of the events in the world and the psychological and spiritual influence of these world events on humanity. While the tablets of the divine plan were written at a critical time in the history of humanity, and they resonated with the needs of that era, and I think they also reflected to some extent the stage of development of the Baha'i community. However, I think it's important to also recognise that their relevance extends far beyond 1916, 1917, that they continue to be relevant to today. And in this regard, let me just share a couple of paragraphs from the 29th of December 2015 message of the Universal House of Justice in terms of the needs of humanity and the responsibility or the opportunities that this provides for the Baha'is. The House of Justice wrote, in setting the goals for the plan, the fact that we need to achieve 5,000 clusters where there's a program of where the program of growth has become intensive, and the House says we set this objective before the Baha'i world, conscious that it's truly formidable, that a Herculean labour will be required, that many sacrifices will have to be made. And then they say this about the state of the world. But faced with the plight of a world that suffers more each day, bereft of Baha'u'llah's elixir, we cannot in conscience ask anything less of his devoted followers. So again, the House of Justice is putting the needs and responsibilities of the community within a context. Reading the social reality, the state of the world demands that certain actions be taken. And again, in this same letter, toward the very end, the coming global endeavour, to which this is the 5-year plan, which we will be summoned, calls for the application of proven strategies, systematic action, informed analysis, and keen insight. Yet above all, it's a spiritual enterprise, and its true character should never be obscured. The urgency to act is impelled by the world's desperate condition. So again, putting our actions, putting our goals, putting our purpose within the context of rescuing humanity at a perilous and critical time in its unfoldment. Okay, what I want to do is to share some ideas about what it is about this book that is of enduring significance and relevance. You know, we know there's 120 countries mentioned, there are lovely prayers, there's guidance about teaching and this and that and the other. But beyond that, I think if we read the tablets of the Divine Plan alongside the current messages of the Universal House of Justice, we derive a much greater understanding of the significance and the importance of the tablets of the Divine Plan. What got me started on this book about 7 years ago was that I read a statement from the Nowruz 2009 message of the Universal House of Justice. It was the message that described Abdu'l-Bahá leaving the Holy Land and beginning his travels to the West. And then in this same message, the House foreshadowed the importance of certain events that were yet to unfold, like the Will and Testament hadn't been written, the tablets of the Divine Plan hadn't been written, and the like. And there was a short reference to what the tablets of the Divine Plan would do that really struck me. And let me just read it. The House says that the tablets of the Divine Plan would set in motion processes designed to bring about, in due course, the spiritual transformation of the planet. Now remember, this was 2009. And I read this and I thought, spiritual transformation of the planet? What the devil does that mean? And beyond that, it was not just that it released processes that would bring this about, but the House said that these processes were designed to bring about, in due course, the spiritual transformation of the planet. So what were these processes? What kind of processes are designed to bring about spiritual transformation? So I read it, and I read it again, and I read it again, and I read it again, and I've continued to read it over the years. And I mean, I think anybody who reads it would may come up with their own particular list. But in looking for this kind of information in this small book, it becomes a very rich and interesting work to study. there's the obvious things, there are things that have immediate relevance, but I think it also defines pathways to ongoing service and transformation that will take us well into the future. And so what I want to do is to share some of the reflections that I've come to about what some of these processes might be, or these ideas that might be, that will transport us to the future. Okay, before doing that, there are a few other statements by the House of Justice about the tablets of the Divine Plan, which appear in subsequent letters after 2009. In one, the House says that the successive teaching plans that are adopted by the Baha'i community over time have all derived their creative power from the tablets of the Divine Plan. So we have to look for what is it that illustrates this creative power. The House of Justice also foreshadowed the future influence of the Divine Plan when it stated, these teaching plans will continue unto the Golden Age. So it's a long-term enterprise. It's going to take us to the fringes of the Golden Age, and the impetus and the direction and the spiritual inspiration comes from our evolving understanding of the guidance in this book, plus the current guidance of the Universal House of Justice. The House of Justice also said in relation to the tablets of the Divine Plan, every effort made by the Friends to systematically propagate the divine teachings traces its origins to the forces set in motion in the Divine Plan. So again, forces set in motion, processes set in motion, creative power. And just one more. Within the Divine Plan are held, the House of Justice said, the seeds of the world's spiritual revival and ultimate redemption. The seeds of the world's spiritual revival and ultimate redemption. Now, in trying to sort of generate some ideas about the long-term significance and the processes, the forces, the ideas in the plan that may help to project us to the fringes of the Golden Age and to bring about the spiritual transformation of the planet, the regeneration of humanity, the revitalization. I'm going to do this in a way that is not immediately connected to the everyday work of the Baha'i community. I want to sort of step back from the coalface and to look at some of the ideas or concepts that seem to me to underlie all of the activities in which we're engaged. And I think it's important to see the underlying concepts, because if we understand the underlying concepts, then as the plans change, as the world changes, as the needs of the community changes, we can become very flexible in deciding what kind of activities are relevant and important to pursue. So this is the purpose of kind of stepping back. And some of it may seem a little bit, well, I don't know, intellectual or philosophical, but tough. Okay, one of the concepts that I think is really critical to and of long-term significance is an understanding of when Baha'is talk about religion having a role in society, we need to really understand this. And this relates to, among other things, the Baha'i perspective on history. We need to begin to think in some of these terms, because I think it will help to sustain our motivation and to give us a clearer understanding about what it is that we're doing when we work hard in our core activities and when we try to engage in community building activities. Part of the Baha'i perspective on history, as it relates to the role of religion in society, is something that sounds very theoretical, but it's very practical and very familiar when you start to think about it. I think the historical mission in which the Baha'i community is engaged, well, we know at heart it's a spiritual enterprise. And underpinning the community's activities is the conviction that the course of history is in large part shaped by the coming of messengers of God. So we're back to progressive revelation, but we need to understand this notion of progressive revelation and attach it to our understanding of history, so that we're confident, we know that God didn't just interact with humanity 2,000 years ago, but this is an ongoing process. It's part of the process of building of civilization. It's the purpose for which we're engaged in community building, because we're laying the foundation for the civilization that's based on the needs of humanity at this time and purified and transformed by the teachings of the manifestation of God. Abdu'l-Bahá addresses the subject of the historical and transformative role of religion in society in one of his tablets. Actually, it's the last one in the book. And he says this, and again, it's simple. He states it in a simple way, but I think we're challenged to think about it at different levels of complexity. Because unless we do this, we're not going to be able to be responsive to the needs of a changing world. Okay, Master says, consider how the religions of God served the world of humanity, how the religion of Torah became conducive to the glory and honor and progress of the Israelitish nation, how the breaths of the Holy Spirit of His Holiness Christ created affinity and unity between divergent communities and quarreling families. Familiar stuff. We know this. But we have to think about it. How the sacred power of His Holiness Muhammad became the means of uniting and harmonizing the contentious tribes and different clans of Peninsular Arabia, to such an extent that 1,000 tribes were welded into one tribe. Strife and discord were done away with. All of them unitedly and with one accord strove in advancing the course of culture and civilization, and thus were freed from the lowest degree of degradation, soaring toward the height of everlasting glories. It picks us up with his words and transports it. Then Abdu'l-Bahá links the capacity of religion to foster unity and transform society and its institutions. He links it to the spirit of the divine teachings. The spirit of the divine teachings. And because it's linked to the spirit of the divine teachings, what's critical is that we share these teachings. We're back to teaching. he says, "This is the most great work. Should you become confirmed therein, this world will become another world, and the surface of the earth will become the delectable paradise, and eternal institutions be founded." So starting with our conception, our perspective on history, and our understanding of the role, the importance of the role of religion in society, it brings an energy to our teaching activities. And when we get tired, we can stop and think, by golly, what we're engaged in is building a civilization. Okay. So I think in pointing to the importance of the important effect of religion in society, the ongoing influence on society and its transformation, that what the Master might be doing is defining a pathway to ongoing social transformation. So we're not just transforming ourselves, but it's a means of transforming society and the planet in the longer term. Okay, another of these concepts that I think have relevance in the very long term, and that is the fact that implicit in the tablets of the Divine Plan is a recognition that the Baha'i faith is a religion of change. And it regards all people as having the purpose of participating in an ever-advancing civilization. And that's what we're here for. The faith aims to create unity between the diverse elements of humankind. Its teachings include principles that are directed to all aspects of human thought and conduct, which promote individual and social development. In fact, the concept of change is really embedded in the teachings of the faith. As a contemporary religion which addresses the issues confronting the modern world, then it follows that for the faith to make its contribution to society, its members need to be aware not only of what's happening in the world, but also be actively engaged in sharing ideas and values and concepts that address the issues of the age. So we have to be out there helping people see an alternative vision. Now, we know that when we're not building this civilization alone, that we're going to need to collaborate with people, like-minded people, who are concerned about the common good and in a spirit of world solidarity and the like. Okay, in terms of this outward-looking orientation, let's go back to the tablets of the Divine Plan and see what Abdu'l-Bahá does. He takes the major problem of the day, war, and which he describes as the destroyer of the foundations of man, and he describes its impact on individuals. And then he prescribes the antidote, peace. But he does a lot more than that. It's not enough just to say, this is the problem, this is the solution. You have to do something about it. So what he does is say, in every city and village, the believers must occupy themselves with the diffusion of the divine exhortations and advices, guide the souls and promote the oneness of the world of humanity. So we've got to get out there, and not just a little bit, but in every city and village. So we're being projected into the world. Okay. And this orientation, this external orientation, impacts all of our activities. The way we look at the world, the way we relate to people, the way our institutions operate, the efforts that we make for community building. Okay, a third of the, and so this I think is another pathway to ongoing social development and ongoing transformation, with possibilities of transformation. A third element is that is the oneness of humankind, the concept of the oneness of humankind, which is an organizing principle for action. We know that when Baha'u'llah proclaimed his message to the world in the 19th century, he made it abundantly clear that the first step essential for the peace and progress of humankind was its unification. And we're familiar with such quotes as, "The fundamental purpose animating the religion of Baha'u'llah is to safeguard the interests and promote the unity of the human race, and to foster the spirit of love and fellowship among men," and the like. In the tablets of the Divine Plan, my reading of them, it seems Abdu'l-Bahá encourages the systematic practice of the oneness of mankind. Among other things, he specifies fellowship and love among the believers as one of the conditions for attaining to the station of being an apostle of Baha'u'llah. And if we have time, we'll get to that toward the end. The Master calls attention. He calls on the inhabitants of the world to free themselves from all ignorant prejudices and to work for the good of all. He exhorts them to engage in the promulgation of divine principles so that the wonders of the world of humanity may pitch her canopy in the apex of America, and all the nations of the world may follow the divine policy. So it demonstrates, I think, the society building aspect of the practice of the oneness of mankind. The House of Justice has enriched our understanding of this principle of the faith when it stated that the oneness of mankind is at once the operating principle and ultimate goal of the faith. The operating principle and ultimate goal of the faith. And there's a lot to be learned from reflecting on those descriptions. And furthermore, that the oneness of mankind implies the achievement of a dynamic coherence between the spiritual and practical requirements of life on earth. The principle of the oneness of mankind impacts not only our relationships with each other, but it impacts the quality of the relationships that develop within our communities. It impacts the interactions between the institutions of the faith and the community. So it impacts the three protagonists. And as such, I think this concept is yet another important pathway to ongoing social transformation. Just a couple more. One is evolutionary change, and these are familiar concepts, but I think they underlie all of the activities in which we're engaged. Okay. Now, I think in thinking about the fact that change evolves, it's evolutionary, it's important to also recognize that it's not haphazard. It's not chaotic. Change is not chaotic. I mean, occasionally it is, but in general, it unfolds. And when we look at the tablets of the divine plan, I think we can see illustrations of some of the consciously planful aspects of actions that can be taken to initiate change. So you can drive change. For example, the tablets articulate the vision of a peaceful and united world where the mirror of the earth may become the mirror of the kingdom, reflecting the ideal virtues of heaven. So we say, that's lovely. That's lovely. But then the Abdu'l-Bahá begins to translate this poetic vision into a concrete plan. And I think this is one of the things that we can learn from studying the tablets of the divine plan. And how does Abdu'l-Bahá translate this vision into a concrete plan? Well, first of all, he specifies that the teachings of the faith need to be promulgated throughout the nations and islands of the world. And we say again, good, yes. We'll propagate the teachings throughout the nations and islands of the world. But where do you get started? So to assist at that time the American Baha'is to approach this massive task in a systematic manner, he not only listed countries and islands by name, but he also specified an order. Go to Mexico first because it's close by, it's efficient. And also he specified geographic areas of particular importance, like Alaska. Now, why did he choose Alaska? I checked to see it's not listed as one of the under the states, the various states of the US, and that probably was because at that time Alaska may well not have been a state. Who knows? So there are particular, and I think from this approach to starting with the vision and then trying to become more concrete and seeing a way ultimately to be systematic is something that we apply in our reflection meetings, in our teaching activities, in deciding what area might be receptive, and the like. Now, not only did the Master help us in sort of identifying goals, but he stressed the importance of taking a first step. We've got a goal now, yep, but how are we going to get it? What to do? One step. And what Abdu'l-Bahá does is refer to the early days of Christianity, and he sets out a really important principle of growth in these terms, or at least it seems to me he does. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Armenia was enveloped with impenetrable darkness. One blessed soul from among the disciples of Christ hastened to that part, and through his effort, ere long that province became illumined. Thus, it has become evident how the power of the kingdom works. One soul arises, makes an effort, is reinforced by the power of the Holy Spirit, the power of the kingdom. And all we need to do is to take the first step to the implementation of a goal that has importance. I think the other thing that Abdu'l-Bahá does in the Tablets of the Divine Plan is instill an awareness of the long-term nature of the enterprise in which we're all involved. And I think he does this by using the analogy of farming. He describes the teacher as a farmer, the activity of teaching as he relates to the actions that farmers take to prepare the soil, to fertilise it. It doesn't use the word fertilise, but to sort of prepare it and look after it and trim the trees and whatever. And I think another thing we learn is that he calls for a realistic assessment of the manner in which a particular task is carried out. And let me give you an example of this from the Tablets of the Divine Plan. He wrote 2 tablets to each of the 5 separate areas of North America. And the first was generally, get up and go, and there's a need to take the faith here, there, and whatever. In the second tablet, at least in one instance, he provides an assessment of where that particular set of states was at. And he says, so far, the summons of the kingdom of God and the proclamation of the oneness of the world of humanity has not been made in these states systematically and enthusiastically. This is Abdu'l-Bahá's assessment of the progress. It hadn't been made systematically and enthusiastically. And then he prescribes, blessed souls and detached teachers have not travelled through these parts repeatedly. Therefore, these states are still in a state of heedlessness. A lot more to be done. And he goes on to emphasize the spiritual and personal qualities of the teacher that are critical for success. And the description of the teacher is just amazing. Okay, so evolutionary. And part of dealing with evolutionary processes is to translate the vision into constructive plans, and plans that are consistent with the present needs of a community. So it's an ongoing process, an ongoing pathway for continued service. The final theme that I observe is the whole business of capacity building, which I see being exemplified in the Tablets of the Divine Plan. And focusing particularly on the role of education. If we look at the Tablets of the Divine Plan, we see emphasis not only on developing the capacity of the individual, but there's also guidance there for community and embryonic administrative structures. Let me give you some examples. On the level of individual capacity building, Abdu'l-Bahá's Tablets of the Divine Plan call for the development of spiritual qualities, the acquisition of a deep knowledge of the history and teachings of the faith, commitment to endeavouring to practice the laws and principles of the faith in one's personal life. These are all things that are specified. For example, we read, the teachers of the cause must be heavenly, lordly, and radiant. They must be embodied spirit, personified intellect, and arise with the utmost firmness, steadfastness, and self-sacrifice. So these are some of the qualities that he identifies. And now to inspire the acquisition of such qualities and to encourage the Baha'is to engage in the act of teaching, Abdu'l-Bahá provides special prayers, a whole collection of prayers for the teacher to recite. And some of them, he says, the person who's arising each morning should say this prayer. And others, this morning and the evening, say this prayer. So he's supporting us in relation to the development of our individual spiritual capacity. In addition, Abdu'l-Bahá encourages those who plan to arise to spread the faith outside of North America to prepare themselves prior to their departure by attempting to learn the language of the place that they're going to, become familiar with the culture and the conditions of the country in which they intend to travel. Okay, as a means of fostering capacity at the level of community, the tablets of the Divine Plan called for classes to be instituted for training teachers, including the youth, and for the holding of meetings to make known and to practice the teaching of the faith. He calls for the appointment of committees charged with translation, publication and distribution of Baha'i literature, and the publication of Star of the West, a magazine which was concerned with promoting information and news about the faith and its worldview. So creating a sense of identity, using the news about the progress of the faith to create a sense of community identity. And also to begin to introduce a literature which is part of any civilization and any culture. And I had to push it a bit with looking at capacity, things that in the tablets of the Divine Plan that foreshadow the emergence of Baha'i administrative structures. But I think I'm pretty safe because there's a reference to the institution of the Mashriq al-Askar, which is one of the great institutions of the faith and the one that is a symbol of service and prayer and administration and spiritual development and the like. Okay. There's one final point that I wanted to call attention to. And it was the second of the ideas that got me interested in studying the tablets of the Divine Plan. And that is Abdu'l-Bahá's invitation to the Baha'is to become apostles of Bahá'u'l-Abhá. I mean, it just is really interesting that, in the old days, in the time of Christ, the apostles were chosen. In the time of Bahá'u'l-Abhá, Abdu'l-Bahá is inviting all of the friends who arise to serve the faith with dedication and focus and persistence. He's inviting us to attain to the supreme station. He refers to it as the supreme station of an apostle of Bahá'u'l-Abhá. Now, we don't get it for nothing, because he establishes three conditions. Basically says, if you want to do this, then there are three things that you have to do. The first is need to be firm in the covenant. You think, yes, firm in the covenant, yes. Second, there has to be fellowship and love among the believers. Yes, that makes sense. And then third, must travel to teach the faith. And in doing this, be inspired by the example of Abdu'l-Bahá. So we have to do it like Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, in thinking about these three conditions, I mean, there's a heck of a lot that can be said, but I won't. And but the point that I've come to in my thinking is that, at least in relation to my own thinking, I'd thought about these three conditions as being relevant mainly to myself as an individual. So that when I thought about firmness in the covenant, then it was, yes, I have to, do the things that it says in the writings and lead a good life and whatsoever. And then in relation to fellowship and love among the believers, I had to get my prejudices under control and be loving and whatever. And then with teaching. But I've come to the conclusion, the more I think about it, that these three conditions are really critical to community building, to social transformation, to the regeneration of society. And in addition to that, I think they are probably also very helpful in enabling us to sustain our efforts in the long term. We know that the spiritual transformation of the planet is going to be centuries, a long time. It's going to take us really to the fringes of the golden age. And how can we keep going without burning out and without sort of thinking, I've just got to take a rest? And I want to explain why I think these three conditions of apostleship are so important in sustaining our efforts and in contributing to the transformation of the planet. Okay. So this is all new thinking, and it may be not very relevant, and I may think about it tomorrow and wished I'd said something else, but here goes. Okay, let's look at each of these three conditions that are necessary to implement if we're going to attain to the station of being an apostle of Baha'u'llah. Okay, let's read Abdu'l-Bahá's description of firmness in the covenant, or why it's important. He says, in the beginning, the believers must make their steps firm in the covenant, so that the confirmations of Baha'u'llah may encircle them from all sides. It attracts confirmations. The cohorts of the Supreme Concourse may become their supporters and their helpers. And the exhortations and advices of Abdu'l-Bahá, like unto the pictures engraved on stone, may remain permanent and ineffaceable in the tablets of all hearts. So what I get from that is that making the effort to be firm in the covenant attracts confirmation and the support of the concourse. And in addition, it gets us to the point where the teachings, if you will, the advices of Abdu'l-Bahá, they become second nature. They're ingrained, they're in our heart to such an extent that it becomes a normal way of being. Now, I mentioned that for me, these three conditions seem to be really linked to social transformation, not only to the transformation of the individual. It doesn't just make the individual a better person, but this has an effect on society. And in reaching this conclusion, I found a letter written by the Universal House of Justice to the Bahá'ís of the world in 1989, in which the House of Justice describes the important contribution of loyalty to the covenant to individual and social transformation. They specifically link it not only to individual transformation, but to social transformation. And I think this is really interesting because we're working at changing the planet in the long term. Okay, now let me just read this statement from the House letter. The House wrote, "It's not enough to proclaim the Baha'i message, essential as that is, we got to do it. It's not enough to expand the roles of Baha'i membership, vital as that is. We want more Baha'is, yes, but it's not enough. Souls must be transformed, communities thereby consolidated, new models of life thus sustained." New models of life, the social impact. Now, transformation is the essential purpose of the cause of Bahá'u'l-Abhá. Yes, we know that it's transformation is the essential purpose of the cause of Bahá'u'l-Abhá. Then the House goes on and says, "But it lies in the will and effort of the individual to achieve it in obedience to the covenant." So it's linked to the covenant. Transformation requires obedience to the covenant, a willingness to support the covenant. And this depends on the will and the effort of the individual. The individual seeing efforts to achieve transformation as part of their obedience to the covenant. Okay, so we've got the link now with society, but the next sentence is really a knockout as well. The House writes, "Necessary to the progress of this life-fulfilling transformation." So they now tell us what's necessary in order to achieve progress in this life-fulfilling transformation. Necessary to the progress of this life-fulfilling transformation is knowledge of the will and purpose of God through regular reading and studying of the Holy Word. So if we want to progress the rate at which transformation is taking place, it requires knowledge of the will and purpose of God through reading the writings and being aware of the guidance of the House of Justice. So you're beginning to see how firmness in the covenant is something with dimensions beyond the individual. It relates to society, it relates to a continued study of the guidance, and I think it's through a continued study of the guidance and practice that we can be ensured that in the long term the transformation of the planet will continue. So it'll motivate us and it'll continue. It's never ending. You never get there. Firmness in the covenant isn't an event. It's a lifelong process. And part of firmness in the covenant is the acquisition of knowledge, learning, being part of the culture of learning, learning how to apply the teachings of the faith to the conditions of society. And there are statements in the House letters about the people engaged in social action, and we have to learn to apply with increasing effectiveness elements of Baha'u'llah's revelation together with the contents and methods of society to the social reality. So learning becomes more and more important and is a critical part of firmness in the covenant. So that firmness in the covenant, which is just the first of the prerequisites, I think it's through it an individual aligns his or her life with the divine purpose. It's like a compass, and you find your way. And it's the covenant in the form of guidance contained in the writings and the counsels of the institutions of the faith that help preserve the clarity of vision and mobilises the united action necessary to accomplish such an objective of this transformation of the planet. Okay, there's a lot more. Let me just foreshadow some of the things in relation to the second condition, and I'll just read the conditions because there's not time to discuss them. But and the second condition was fellowship and love among the believers. And Abdu'l-Bahá writes, he describes really a high standard of conduct associated with this prerequisite. He says the divine friends must be attracted to and enamoured of each other and ever be ready and willing to sacrifice their own lives for each other. Does that happen very often? This is a high, high standard. Should one soul from amongst the believers meet another, it must be as though a thirsty one with parched lips has reached the fountain of the water of life, or a lover has met his true beloved. It's a really, really high standard. I refer you to some of the recent letters of the Universal House of Justice where they've expanded our understanding of the principle of the oneness of mankind. They've described it as the principle that is to infuse all facets of organised life on the planet. So again, the social impact of the principle of the oneness of mankind. It's just not interpersonal relationships, but it's a principle that's to infuse all facets of organised life on the planet. And in another place, the House says that it's not enough just to cooperate with the peoples and nations of the world, but what the practice of the oneness of mankind calls for a complete reconceptualization, a whole rethinking of the relationships that sustain society. And this is something that we'll be chewing on for generations. But I guess what I'm saying is that there are principles and ideas that are really familiar, that at this time the House of Justice is challenging us to revisit and to begin to understand at a much more fundamental level. Because unless we understand these principles at a more fundamental level, then we won't be as effective in sharing the Baha'i ideas and implying the Baha'i ideas to the problems confronting society. So it's a way of encouraging our development, but also building capacity in the longer term that will enable us to undertake the actions to which the Baha'i community is currently being called to perform. And then the final element was the teachers must continually travel, but they must travel like Abdu'l-Bahá.